After a 20-year-long legal battle, a major trial has begun at a New York City federal court. It's called Chevron Corp versus Stephen Donziger, and it calls attention to an environmental disaster at an oil field in Ecuador that dates all the way back to 1964. The oil field in question was operated by Texaco, later bought out by Chevron. It was an area of pristine Amazon rainforest, 3 times the size of Manhattan, but has since been subject to the catastrophic effects of oil contamination. See, Texaco spent decades dumping an estimated 65 billion gallons of toxic waste directly into the ground. By 1995, Ecuador's national oil company, Petroecuador, had seized most of the land destroyed by Texaco and reached a settlement with the oil giant in which Texaco agreed to clean up a portion of the contaminated land. And since Chevron acquired Texaco in 2001, Chevron has said that its hands are clean, its obligations already fulfilled. But Chevron did nothing to address the damage done to entire communities directly impacted by contamination. And up until 2011, Chevron probably thought it had gotten away scot-free, until an Ecuadorian court ruled in favor of the spill victims, awarding indigenous communities $18.5 billion to be paid by Chevron. But as underdeveloped exploitation and immunity for oil companies goes, Chevron wasn't going to let that slide. Yep, what should have been an unprecedented win against corporate impunity wasn't. Instead, it's become a long, drawn-out legal battle between one of the largest oil companies in the world and indigenous residents of the Amazon rainforest. These Ecuadorians continue to suffer from a slew of health effects, a direct result of living on this toxic land. Chevron, having no remaining presence in their country, has managed to avoid paying 1 cent of the $18.5 billion owed. Moreover, the oil giant is now accusing Stephen Donziger, the attorney representing villagers in the case, of committing fraud by bribing justice officials in Ecuador to rule against Chevron. And just to add insult to environmental injuries, Chevron recently subpoenaed the federal government for private data belonging to activists, lawyers, and journalists who criticized the company over the course of the trial. After all of this blatant criminality, Chevron still maintains that they are the victims here, victims of a mass extortion conspiracy. Yes, Chevron, the world is conspiring against you. It's amazing that the legal team representing the actual victims is now what's in question. Just yesterday, dozens of activists rallied outside the courthouse in New York where Chevron's extortion charge just kicked off. So how much is this latest trial setting back the real issue at hand? Justice for those who were poisoned. To help me break down the latest in this case, I'm joined by Han Shan, spokesperson for the Ecuadorian victims of Chevron contamination. Thanks so much for coming on, Han.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
So what's your response to Chevron saying, you know what, we bought out Texaco, it wasn't us who created the disaster?
Well, quite simply, you mentioned adding insult to injury. I think one of the most important points about this whole case is that it's not just Stephen Donziger on trial. Chevron has actually sued the victims of its contamination in the most sort of egregious new form of blaming the victim. Chevron is suing under RICO all of the 47 named plaintiffs who were part of the class action that originally took them to court for contamination, massive contamination throughout the Ecuadorian Amazon. So it's not just Stephen, it's not just their legal advocates here in the U.S. It's actually the Ecuadorian victims of Chevron's widespread pollution throughout the rainforest that are named in this suit and who are defending themselves in court this week.
Thanks for explaining that. Talk about this contamination. Talk about the actual scope of it, because I really haven't been able to get a proper assessment.
Certainly. To show that I'm fair, it should be noted that you mentioned, I think, in the setup, that they dumped some 65 billion gallons of toxic wastewater. Now, we don't have evidence of that, and I think it's actually much lower. They've actually admitted in a newspaper ad, actually trying to clear up the facts in the matter, that they've dumped 16 billion. That's still a tremendous amount. That's polluting 24/7 for the near 25 years that Texaco, now Chevron, operated in the region. Now, they dump this toxic wastewater directly into the streams and rivers and marshes, these streams and rivers in the area that are depended upon by thousands of people for drinking water, for bathing, for fishing in. This was an area that was pristine when Texaco arrived in 1964 to begin oil operations. and now it is a wasteland of environmental disaster. You know, it was an environmental free-fire zone, essentially, for several decades. And there are waste pits that Chevron left behind that are open-air, unlined, sludge-filled, crude-filled waste pits that leach into the groundwater and into the soil. I mean, the water's poisoned everywhere, so that the victims, the Ecuadorian villagers who live in that area, suffer from an epidemic of oil-related illness, cancer, birth defects, miscarriages. It's a horrific thing to behold, and I've been there myself numerous times. And I wish anybody who doesn't necessarily believe the facts in the case to investigate this, because really Chevron's allegations in this new RICO suit are really just the latest egregious stage of its campaign to evade accountability.
And let's go back a little bit, because I think the part that's most startling is the fact that Chevron actually lost this case and was ordered to pay for reparations and damages, and then they basically were just able to completely avoid this at all. How did that happen?
Well, Chevron has just thumbed its nose at the entire legal system in Ecuador. And it's important to note that in 1993, this lawsuit that they lost was originally filed right here in New York, in the same court where they're now litigating this case against the Ecuadorian victims of their pollution. It was filed in 1993 because that's where the headquarters, in New York, because that's where the headquarters of Texaco was at the time, and it seemed like the appropriate forum to hear the case. Now, Chevron fought for 10 years and prevailed in their efforts to move the case to Ecuador. That was the forum that they chose. That was the forum that they said in numerous affidavits was the most fair, most appropriate, most transparent forum to hear the case. And in 2011, after 8 years of litigation down in Ecuador that included some 220,000 pages of trial evidence in the case record, eventually, they were found guilty. They were found liable of massive contamination, which everybody knew. But basically, they were expecting an adverse judgment. And expecting an adverse judgment, they launched this retaliatory RICO lawsuit, this campaign to evade accountability. And that's where we're at now. Amazing.
So not only did they force the lawsuit out of the country, but then when they did, they used that kind of as a justification to say, hey, you guys bribed these officials. Absolutely unbelievable. And not only have they not paid any money, they're now alleging that indigenous Ecuadorians and their lawyers committed fraud. What is the actual claim? I mean, what evidence do they have to back up these allegations?
Well, basically, I was saying to somebody recently, I can't recall, but that they've really done a fantastic job of just the most amazing sort of political and media jujitsu, where they've taken all of the things that they've done over the course of this 20-year legal fight, corrupting the judicial process, bribing judges, attempting to entrap witnesses, falsifying evidence, and they've basically accused us of doing it. And what they have is the tremendous power and might of one of the largest, most colossal corporations that has ever existed in human history, and they're putting it all behind this case. They have thousands of associates working on this, from legal, from lawyers to private investigators that they've hired to lobbyists to PR flacks, and they're throwing everything that they have at it because I think that they're nervous not just about paying for the disaster that they created and helping the victims of the company's pollution, but I think that they're concerned about the precedent that it could set for holding companies like Chevron accountable for their abuses, whether at home or abroad.
Thank you so much. We need to keep the pressure up, hold Chevron accountable for this mess. Absolutely incredible. The tactics of intimidation are just astounding. Thank you so much, Han Shan, spokesperson for Ecuadorian victims of Chevron contamination.
Thank you.